Good evening and welcome home to Grace Avenue United Methodist Church. We are so thrilled that you have come to join us this evening for our fourth and final conversation called Next Steps. We have been joining together on some very important issues around race and the world that we live in, and I am so thrilled tonight for us to have this opportunity to talk about race and religious expression. Our guest host during these Next Steps conversation has been Dr. Ron Henderson, who is the District Superintendent of the North Central District of the North Texas Annual Conference. We are delighted to have Dr. Henderson again tonight. Ron, welcome. Good to see you.
Good to be here with you again.
Also tonight, our very special guest is Bishop Mike McKee. Bishop McKee is the bishop of the Dallas Episcopal area and the North Texas Conference of the United Methodist Church. And we are thrilled to have Bishop McKee with us tonight. Bishop, welcome.
It's good to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
You bet. So we were talking as we began tonight and thought maybe one of the best ways we could start is just talk a little bit about our awareness of things growing up related to race. And so I just wonder if each of us could talk just for a moment about when did we really become aware of race and maybe more importantly racism as we were growing up? So Bishop, I'm going to start with you.
So Dr. Henderson and I are about the same age, and so our experiences are very different about that. I can remember as a little boy going to a department store downtown in Fort Worth, Texas, and parking in the Stripling parking garage and then walking through the basement to get to the store instead of across the street. And there were two water fountains, and they looked very different. And one, I learned what little I could read at the time as a 5-year-old said, "For whites only." And the other one that didn't look as good, sort of a metal one, said, "For colored." And I asked my mother what that was about, and she said a few things. And so I immediately, my first act of defiance in terms of civil rights was really drinking from the one said "for colored," because I didn't understand what difference it made from what water fountain you drank. And then I began to think about everything I saw in Fort Worth.
Approximately what year was that?
I think I was 5 or 6, and it just became emerging. I can remember we'd go down the South Freeway, and I'd look over. I said, "Who lives in those little shotgun houses?" I didn't call them. That's what they looked, and I said, "That's where Negroes live."
So about the mid-50s?
Yep, about the mid-50s. So you'd sort of know the area I'm talking about, probably. And so I just thought, I don't understand. I didn't understand it. It did not make sense. And so reflecting back on that, I realized that to be racist meant that you were taught to be. Because initially, I just thought people were people.
Wow.
I think it's worth holding that thought for later, that
Okay.
you're taught to be.
Yeah.
That you said racist is what you're taught to be. You're not born that way.
Right.
So that may be worth putting a pin in that to come back to that
I
later.
think so.
Well, I also think it has to do just with experiences. So I grew up in Tyler, Texas. Many of you know that. And my experience in Tyler, church-wise, I was a part of this wonderful old United Methodist Church on the red brick streets of downtown Tyler. And I have to tell you that my church experience was wonderful. But in the church where I grew up, there were no people of color. And the only people of color that were around my church were people that actually were employed there. And that was mainly some of the custodial staff. And then we had a full kitchen that actually served meals. And some of the kitchen staff were people that were black. And so that was the only black people I ever saw in my church, or people of color that I ever saw in my church. But conversely, when I got to high school, I started playing basketball. And as I played basketball, our basketball team obviously was made up of a variety of people of different color. And I became friends with those guys I played basketball. We had a really good basketball team. We were 35-3 my senior year. And some of my best friends that I still stay in contact with. And I've always wondered about the fact that I had an experience in my high school basketball team that I didn't have at my church growing up.
Yeah.
And it affected me, I think, in the way, that experience of how I began to see myself in relation to the church and wondered about that very thing as I kind of went on in my life. Ron, tell us your story.
Well, my early consciousness was not as much about racism as it was racial division, because I grew up in segregation. And when you grow up in segregation in the 50s and 60s, as I did, then a segregated world becomes the world you know. You know, the school is all black, the community is all black, the movie theaters we went to were all black, and so you're not aware of racism because you're in this black bubble of a segregated world. Even the school, even though it was part of the La Vega Independent School District, there was a separate black division, the Prairie View League. I don't know if you've
Yeah, I
heard of
remember
that.
that.
You know, whereas the Anglos had the UIL, University Interscholastic League, Intercalated League, the blacks were the Prairie View League. And so everything was held at Prairie View, state track, band, etc. So you're aware of this division, and so my consciousness of racism mostly was watching television, seeing the civil rights movement take place in the Deep South. Now what happened is when the school districts began to integrate in 67, 68, they did away with the Prairie View League, and we became a part of the UIL. And so there was at least some unity in terms of the district there. So my consciousness was more of racial division, and it probably didn't make that leap to understanding racism more deeply until I was much older.
So there are obviously these discussions, including, has been a lot of attention given in the last month and a half to what's going on in our country related to race. And one of the things that I think all three of us agree about is that somehow this feels a little different than it has before. We're hopeful of that. But I also know the three of us have been very much shaped by the church. We've found our calling in the church. We've been United Methodist. And we want the church to have something to say about this right now. We've talked in these conversations about a variety of different things, voter engagement and economic injustice, and last week we talked about the justice system. But tonight we're talking about the church. And so I wonder if we can start tonight by just talking a little bit about what does the church need to do and say in the midst of this current situation we find ourselves in related to race in the United States.
I think the church needs to say the truth, and without fear. And I think that's a challenge in some of our churches. I think it's a challenge just for our pastors because of the pushback that they get. So this is the truth. Racism exists in the church. And racism and segregation and even slavery was sort of embedded in the life of the Christian church in many places. And you don't easily get rid of that kind of cancer in the system. I want to be clear about that. But what we do is we speak the truth, and we just hold it up, and we hold the mirror up. And we need to do it not as a political statement. It becomes one, I know, but it is an act of faith, and it's the act of being truly Christian to call out racism and to teach anti-racism. I think that, so I think the church needs to speak truth. And I think the other thing is we need to realize we didn't get here overnight. We're not going to solve this overnight. And so this is a long, long period of work that will outlast any of our ministry, and maybe the generation behind us even. But it's just a continual teaching about what is true, what is right.
Well, I'm going to make a judgment statement, a judgmental statement, because I'm going to say the church's voice addressing racism has probably taken place at another level.
This time?
Historically.
Oh, yeah, you're right, historically.
I'm going to say that conversation has taken place at the institutional level.
Right.
The voice came from the theologians. The voice came from the academy. The voice came from the general agencies. And so they gave clarity to it, but I don't think they gave a movement from the church. Now I understand that's very judgmental. I think there probably has always been isolated pockets of individuals and individual churches that spoke against racism. Our dear friend in the cabinet, Vic Cassad, has a story of his father-in-law, Ben Oliphant, who took a strong stance in Louisiana and may have been run out of the state.
No, the Ku Klux Klan burned a cross in the front lawn.
So I think there.
He ran out of that town. I mean, he had to change and move the next
Yeah,
year.
that was Baton Rouge, wasn't it? Well, in Louisiana anyway. But so there have always been individuals and churches, but in terms of, say, the body itself, I don't know if it has been galvanized. I don't even know if we've been structured that way, that we can move United Methodism to speak against something, since we had to do it in a general conference. And usually if we did something there, it went to agencies. So I think we're in a new age now where we have a number of pastors, colleagues, who are committed, who have a good social conscience, good theological clarity. In our case, a bishop who takes the lead, says there are not going to be racism, at least in our boundaries, at least amongst United Methodists. And I think we've even tried to take it outside the boundaries of Methodism into other causes. So I think it's a new day. I think historically the theologians have been the voice.
I would affirm that too, because I never heard a preacher say anything about race or integration ever growing up. I didn't hear it till I went to Austin to go to the University of Texas, and there was a preacher. I mean, whatever it was, he was out in front.
Remember our first week, we talked about Dr. King's despair at the silence of the white church.
Sure.
And also their accusation against him.
Right.
But they were quiet, and I don't think we are as quiet now as a church, certainly as a United Methodist church, but I think we can be a much more potent force for justice and righteousness.
So how does that happen because Ron, part of what I hear you talking about is not a movement that is top down, but a movement now that comes up from the grassroots. And so one of the things I'd be interested in us discussing for a few moments is then most everyone that is with us tonight are lay people who are sitting in the pews, not now, but normally sitting in the pews and are talking to one another in their small groups and their Sunday school classes and in the parking lots. What would you say to those folks about how we need to confront racism in our church? What do our lay people need to be saying to one another?
What's interesting is that I think some of them work for corporations that probably address this better than the church has. So they're key to having those kinds of conversations, fostering them, which we actually have a plan for in the conference. But what I'm saying is you have people who are really attuned to that. And it's like, so find out who those people are, and we need to start talking with them and enlisting their help. I think there are a lot of things we can do. I mean, we're moving fast on a plan in terms of our journey towards racial justice. And in fact, they're moving faster than I thought they were going to be able to this summer. And so we'll roll some things out over the next several months. But we have to realize that, first of all, we have to empower clergy and help them know that they don't get, they're not being judged about their appointment about speaking boldly and courageously. We're clear about that with laity, so they understand. And I think laity want that to happen. I think the number of people who've been involved in protests over the last several weeks have been just a very different group than normal in terms of, we're talking about a lot of people who have just gone down, stand, march, whatever. And there are several things we can do, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later when we get into the nitty-gritty of that. I'll be glad to do that.
Well, I think Grace Avenue could be an example. For example, you pastor a large congregation, but as you've had these discussions over the last 4 weeks, it's been the voice from Grace Avenue and not the voice of the broader institution. I would consider that kind of a grassroots.
I would too.
It's not a grassroots church, but when you put it in the midst of the big organization of 9 million United Methodists, and Grace Avenue begins to take a lead, even if it's just discussion, getting clarity, understanding, articulating the sin and the wickedness. I think that's a grassroots movement. I think it's probably taking places in a lot of our churches right now. As a matter of fact, I know so. I hope it's more than an emotional response that's going to fade in a few weeks. And I think that's part of our challenge.
Right.
Right. What do we do beyond these 4 weeks? How does this really become a movement or a big agenda for Grace Avenue as a grassroots movement? Right. I think there will also be an institutional movement also that the bishop will probably talk about later. But I see this as grassroots movement because even though this is a very significant church in Frisco, it's representing the local body versus the broader institution, even though I think it has the affirmation and solidarity with the larger institution.
Right. So one of the things that happens in that discussion is you have a lot of really good well-intentioned people that want the church to be more diverse racially. And I've had even people in our congregation say, why can't our church be more racially diverse? Why can't we get more people of color to come and be with us? We're welcoming, we're friendly, we're nice, we're theologically sound. How would you answer someone in my congregation who would say, why can't we get more people of color to come to our church?
Well, I have a thought.
Okay.
When our churches, our United Methodist churches, want to reach more young members in terms of age, then we create worship services and programs that we think reach that group. For example, we'll invest the money and restructure the building and come up with modern worship or contemporary worship because we feel like this will attract them. And so we make the investment to reach that demographic. Okay. We say that in terms of wanting to reach other minority groups, but I haven't seen us make the investment that we have worship and other activities that appeal to that group. So, and you and I have talked about this here at Grace Avenue. How do we create a worship service here that is inviting to African Americans and other groups? So I think we have to have worship and other activities that says when you come here, we're going to have something new and exciting, and we're not going to demand that you be totally like us.
You know, I think Ron's got a good point about young people. So, in terms of their very lives and lifestyle, they are more accustomed to a diverse group of friends. I mean, and so if they don't see the church moving in a direction, at least on the side of racial justice, then they're not going to be in our churches anyway. It doesn't matter. It's not about that. But if we do that, then they'll realize, okay, this may be a place that we can go together. But I think a lot of it has to do with our voice right now that will bring about that in the future.
I think that's an important statement because I've heard in our churches, particularly when I was at Custer Road, a number of young people choose colleges, universities to go to that's more diverse. I had a very influential family at Custer Road whose children were on the Allen-Plano borderline. So they could go to Allen School District, or they could go to Plano, or they could go to Plano West. And her children chose to go to Plano East because it was had more diversity. So I think our young people are ahead of the church. And every time I see a good movement like that, and I see that it's ahead of the church, it always gives me, it's a good thing on one hand, but it's a bad feeling on the other that the church is lagging behind. I think you're absolutely right. Young people almost demand diversity, as we've seen in the protests and marches lately.
It's been very diverse, that group.
And in that respect, very encouraging.
And that sort of affirms what we're saying, is that until we get that right, we're not going to get the other thing. I mean, we're not going to deal with race. It's not going to look as diverse as we would like.
For the most part, they didn't learn racism, or they rejected it.
Right.
Then on the other hand, we'll be blindsided on the news when we see some racist act of some fraternity.
Right.
Those days have got to come to an end.
Right.
But young people, yes, have shown their commitment to a diverse America.
Right. Well, and then we have to meet those young people where they are. It's not about us saying, come into the church and let us indoctrinate you into the ways, and you need to act like us, and if you can act like us, then we're all going to be happy. There's a point at which the church has to go out and meet those young people and say, we are willing to partner with you in the world, and then that way we can share in the ministry together of the church and what Jesus Christ stands for.
You know, the part of that, too, is to be like us, but we want them to worship like us.
Yeah.
Of course, I think it's difficult to even say, okay, this style's for this group, this style's for that group. You just can never know.
Right.
I mean, I've got a story about that it's really, it does involve race and differences. When I'm in Honduras, I'm surprised at how liturgical they want to be in worship. I didn't expect that. But at their annual meeting, and it's very liturgical.
Wow.
At times.
Right.
Billy, one of the things I've been hearing lately, and I think it makes sense, it's beginning to make sense to me. I think most of our churches, all of your members, hopefully all of them, none are racist. And I've been hearing lately that it's not enough not to be racist. It takes more now. We got to be anti-racist. That's an altogether different movement.
Right. Right. Say more about that, Ron. What?
Well, you'll have to jump in and help me, but I'm beginning to like it, because what it says is not only are you not racist, but it means that you're not going to tolerate racism.
Right.
Not only from individuals, but we're not going to tolerate it from institutions. The systemic racism. That's the whole battle right now. Right. And that's a harder thing, because we're taking on big brother, big uncle, the big institutions that have the muscle to go with that systemic racism.
Right. Well, and that's addressed, I think, goes back to what the bishop said at the beginning about speaking truth, and how important that is, as opposed to just trying to deny what we are. The book White Fragility brings up that so many people, when they're confronted with racism, say things like, well, I'm not racist, I'm from the North, or I'm not racist, I went to a school that had more than 50% people of color than white people, or I'm not racist because I grew up in a family that didn't teach me that. Well, that's very passive and also not really true. It's a very different thing to be on the other side and be anti-racist and to say, no, I'm going to speak truth.
Yes.
Truth to power in the moment, and the power may be your friends or your peers or others, and you have to be willing to be anti-racist. And I think that's the question: is, are our churches ready to be anti-racist?
Well, it's a theological concept if you think about it. So it's one thing, to we talk about racist and how to be anti-racist, and the dichotomy. So the sin of omission, by not speaking up when a racist act or something happens, is really worse than the act itself, because you're really not living or speaking your truth, or you're afraid to. And that's how people get into letting things sort of coast along because they want to get along. And so how many of us have ever called out someone who said something racist? And until we're all willing to do that, including the uncle at Thanksgiving or our best friend, so we're not willing to do it.
Not meaning to put you on the spot, but what about an SPRC meeting?
So, true story, North Texas Conference, sometime in the last 8 years, so we don't know when, or y'all don't, I do. So I was in a conversation with the SPR committee and sort of a challenge about something, and then finally somebody said, Bishop, I need to be honest with you, and this was not on the table, but I wouldn't accept, I won't do the language, it wasn't bad language, but basically I would say no to a person of color.
As their pastor.
As their pastor. So I thought, I want to sit here and see how long this lasts. And I'm sure it felt like 20 minutes to them. It was actually about 30 seconds. And then I said, I cannot believe I just heard that in the United Methodist Church in the North Texas Conference. Dead silence again. And then I looked at all the other members of the committee and I said, but the thing that really disturbs me the most is he said it and you said nothing. And so to be honest, that's an example of an act of omission. I mean, a sin of omission by not speaking up.
Right.
It also says people who don't see themselves as racist, but they're not willing to embrace racial equality. Okay, runs a good pastor, but we don't want him as our spiritual leader. And when they say that, because they see my skin different. It doesn't matter how many degrees one may have or how articulate one may be. And this is really not broad, but I'm just trying to give an example. Because we don't get beyond that until I keep saying it, get beyond constitutional justice and equality and deal with real racial equality with a clear understanding and commitment that neither one of us is superior to the other or inferior to the other in terms of who we are. Now, if it comes to intellect, I don't mind being the inferior one here tonight.
You're not the inferior one here tonight or anything.
I don't know about that. But, Ron, I think that's really important, especially, I mean, we think about even the way Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount.
Yes.
And he really talks about the law of love. I mean, he comes to fulfill the law. And there are a lot of laws we have now related to race, and we are continuing to try to.
Yes.
But one of the things that the church can do that no other institution does is that we can appeal to the law of love and say it's not enough just to do the lowest common denominator in terms of race, but we need to aspire to the law of love in which we go to that place in which Jesus says, I say to you, this person is your brother, is your sister, and should be treated in a fashion of equality, not just some kind of tolerance.
And I think we have to be in our tradition intentional in creating those opportunities. As an example, a year ago, you had an African American male clergy on your staff that your people fell in love with, and you and the cabinet were intentional in bringing that person here. And it'll be interesting to know how they experienced him, and if the way they experienced Bryant when he was here, now is that the way they see all black people, or if they just the way they saw Bryant. I was thinking when you talked about your basketball experience, and I was thinking, what did you learn in that experience that this congregation can learn? That you may not ever had any fears, but you had to live with those guys, right. Almost as much as you lived anywhere else, save home.
Right.
And that I'm certain that changed your perspective in many ways. Right. And so I think we have to be intentional in creating those opportunities where people can experience persons unlike them, their realness.
Yeah, and I don't know that
you their humanity.
I don't know that you necessarily. It's beyond being in a sanctuary or worship gathering together.
Yes,
I mean, it's about sharing a life of service together, any number of ways. But I got to thinking about when you talk about the biblical pieces, for instance. One of the things that has been uppermost in my mind is those two great commandments when Jesus was asked, depending on which gospel, who asked him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And then the second one is like the first, and you shall love your neighbor as you love yourself. And so if we're unable to love another, what are we really saying about how we value ourselves? Right. I've said a sermon one time that says, it really pains me to think that some of you so devalue who you are that you have to put somebody else down to feel good about who you are. But that's really what racism is. You're devaluing yourself. I mean, you don't think highly of yourself, so you have to devalue somebody else so you can feel better.
That's what all self-hatred is about.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and it denies the fact that we are created in the image of God.
Exactly.
We loathe ourselves, and yet by doing that, we remove ourselves from the image.
We really don't think about creation theology enough when you think about that.
Right.
And we get into that Adam and Eve story real quick, and we have to stay in that first chapter of Genesis. Although it says that in Adam and Eve, you're creating the image of God, but we focused on that fall so much that we don't focus on how we were created originally.
Right.
And that was in the very image.
Okay, insider Grace Avenue moment for a second. Use your imagination. Use your imagination. All right, I want to talk about the fact that we are in this moment, and we talk about the passion that is going on in this moment. But one of the things all of us fear is that what if this is a moment that then just wanes and we go on to something else and the news cycle changes and all that. I think one of the ways that it changes is through clear strategy that we can stay on top of. And one of the things that's happening is that in the North Texas Conference, our bishop has put together an initiative that is called the Journey Towards Racial Justice. And Bishop, I'd love for you to just take a few minutes and describe it for us and tell us what progress is being made in the journey towards racial justice.
Yeah, so we have a number of people on the core team working on that. It has been expanded with an advisory group who will do a lot of work as well, and we'll continue to expand that team. So I'm not working closely with that team. I get briefed every time they meet, and sometimes I sit in on a meeting and so we basically, and we did this at Covenant Day, we narrowed our focus down in the annual conference to three basic things. One is vital conversations, intercultural competence, and institutional equity. So let me just sort of say this, that we realize that a lot of this involves some teaching, it involves a lot of conversations, and so already they're ramping up, getting ready to launch all the conversations in terms of what will happen. Some of us have been a part of a significant conversations. The clergy have 2 or 3 times around issues of race. I mean, we did at Covenant Day, focusing on our baptismal vows, and Bishop Palmer was our guest and was with us. We had done it before as well at another Covenant Day, so it's been something that we've been doing. And so the challenge is, that I said all along, is we need to share what we're learning. Our clergy need to be taught to share what they're learning with the laity in our congregation. And again, as I said, our laity, many of them have been in large corporations, small corporations, that they know what this is about. And so that we've got to do that, have those same kinds of conversations that can be very helpful. So I have benchmarks that I'm wanting the group to set about, how many people from each church, and that sounds sort of really, but I think it's about beginning to create a culture in all of our churches about how to have those difficult, vital conversations around race. So many of us have done it through Project Unity, which Together We Dine, that Richie Butler has started. Some of us have been to those. We're going to multiply that. There have been some other kinds of conversations we had in the past that we'll do, and so they worked on that, I know, a lot today. The other thing is that we don't think that we've done significant amounts of teaching. And so when I told the story early on about being a child and then learn to realize you had to learn to be a racist or whatever, that we probably need to start doing significant teaching with children and youth as well. And so we're drawing up how that would look. Now look, the challenge is that even in a connectional system, to get everybody to do something is, it's a challenge. But we're gonna do the best we can, and so we're gonna work with a coalition of the willing. But it's been amazing about how many. I'm not amazed by this, but so many of our large church pastors have been so clear with me about that they want to do more than they've ever done before about any number of things related to this. So we're talking about, and then about those kinds of conversations that we're going to involve hopefully several thousand people across the conference in. Second piece is the whole idea about intercultural competence. I mean, there are things that that Ron can say that I can't say, or about how it is that people relate, or how it is that people respond, coming out of the cultures they come out of. And we don't all do things alike. And so how do we appreciate that? And what do we do? And how do we understand what it's like to be a person of color? And this can happen with our Latinos people as well in our churches or throughout the Dallas area or around. And we have a couple of Asian American pastors who've said it's happened to them. And so this is just for people of color. So how do we help Anglos understand the kind of things that is a daily walk for them? You get stopped where Billy, you and I wouldn't get stopped, or any number of things, the way you just are discounted, and those kinds of things. Those are cultural competence things, and to understand the kind of pain that people walk with every day of their lives because of that, we need to understand that. And so the whole piece about competence in that, and then institutional equity is going to be the most challenging, I think, Ron, don't you, to
Yes.
have? Is like, what are some things that we have to do to create equity in the churches in the annual conference? I think that we'll probably get a group of people together who really could work on this, have had to do this in their corporations, their companies, those kinds of things, and say, okay, what is this? Let's start talking about what that might look like. We do have some ideas the cabinet are going to use in terms of talk to the board of ordained ministry about, not in terms of who gets qualified and credentialed, but in terms of how we form people in that piece, in terms of equity and in terms of when they do residencies, what we do in terms of appointments. And that's something we really focused on about earlier we're in June. And so those are the pieces.
Yeah, I'm looking at how that committee is going to lead the conference in our churches to how do we extinguish a system, a broad system of racism. I'm influenced right now by David Blight. I'm reading his analysis of his biography of Frederick Douglass, Bondage and Freedom. And the whole concept of Frederick Douglass was to completely extinguish slavery. And that was his whole thrust, get rid of the whole system. So we got these systemic systems of racism. And so I'm looking at, I'm very confident that group will lead our conference to being a transformative conference. But I'm looking, how do it lead our churches to having transformative movements where we change this system of racism in America? Right. that crops up again and again and again, and then when we see something horrible, as we saw with George Floyd, then everybody reacts to it. But just a few years ago, we reacted to Charlottesville. Right. And then a few years after that, we all reacted to McKinney. And all of our pastors were preaching about it. So how are we going to have a movement that is going to be truly transformative, that we're eliminating these systems? That's a much harder task. Now, I believe in knowing our church, when we go to general conference, we're probably going to have some strategy or concept or theological position. I would just imagine. Knowing us, we will. We have to. So, many of the corporations are making plans, as we say, racism is not going to be not only part of their corporation, but racism is not going to be a part of America.
Right.
I think our church, our beloved church, and I think it will have to say racism is certainly not going to be a part of our church, but it's not going to be a part of our land.
Right.
That's a tall order, though.
Right. But it takes strategy, and then it takes follow-through.
Yeah, and so, like I said, this is a long piece of work, but I read some of the strategies this afternoon. I was talking with Andy Lewis, who's the staff person who's working with this team on this, and the strategies are really good. And I don't want to talk about them tonight necessarily, because I don't want to get ahead of them making their announcement. But I think they're, for the lack of a better word, I think we're looking at ways to bake this in to who we are as United Methodists in North Texas, and to say, you know what, that we're just not going to tolerate that. And if somebody doesn't like that, it's like, tell us why you don't like it, and let's have conversation with somebody who can help there, but don't just walk out the door. But I do think it's important. Here's something that's happened this time. So our clergy are younger today than they were 8 years ago. So we've got to remember that has been a key to a lot of conversation. And so this committee is not the normal committee that we would have in the North Texas Conference or in any other conference. There are a lot of young people on there, some young people of color who are also going to do some other pieces of work. That's really helpful because they and the young clergy in the conference are the most galvanized group about this in the annual conference, I think. What do you think?
Yes.
Billy, do you?
Yes, absolutely.
So I think they're the teachers to us in so many ways. And so we're letting people who are sort of have lived this and have very different experiences than anything you and I, than we've talked about tonight. I'm not saying they've been perfect experiences at all, because they can tell some significant stories. But, you know, if you have them involved, they're not going to let this go away. And so what we have to do is just sort of turn over the reins of a lot of this and let them lead us through this. I think this is the best thing that could happen right now.
Because I was going to ask you, you got a budding theologian at a major American institution at Boston University.
Sure.
So I'd be interested in your conversations you've had with him lately.
Well, I think the conversation we've had with Colin, who is my son that's at the School of Theology at Boston University, have been around the fact that some of the things that we are fighting in the church are just things they're not fighting in some of the other areas of his life. I mean, and of course, you know, again, being in an academic setting, he gets to be exposed to a lot of other things. But I just think a lot of our young colleagues, which is what they are, you know, they are not lesser than, they are not people that need more tenure. They are our colleagues. So many of our younger colleagues that are serving on this initiative, Bishop, are so important, and Colin's one of them, because they just don't get bogged down in the conversations that some of our peers or we have gotten bogged down in.
Their DNA is different.
Absolutely.
It's in their DNA.
So
that's why I raised the question.
Right. But I think for him, he's just sometimes astounded at why we are fighting about some of the things we are still fighting about.
I hear the bishop say that about his daughter all the time also.
Yeah.
Can't believe y'all still arguing over this.
Well,
over several things, Ron.
Yes, I know.
Yeah.
well,
But it's still in their DNA.
Oh, yeah.
The way they see people, the way they embrace people, the way they affirm people, the way they embrace the image of God without any prejudice, whatever it is.
Let's make no mistake, the future of the United Methodist Church is at stake because of that.
Yes.
I agree. So people talk about, we've been through any number of movements in the United Methodist Church about how to grow the church. So let's put that aside for a minute. So what would happen if we just did the right thing? And I'm not saying that we're doing bad things, but what I'm saying is okay, let's quit. We focus on improving rather than imagining the church that God wants to have. Use the word imagine. It's a word I like to use. So we need to learn to imagine what it is God really has in mind. And I can promise you it may be very different than what we're doing.
Right.
No, it is very different than what we're doing. It's not that our worship's bad. I'm not saying that. It's just, okay, we need you to focus then. I think if God could whisper in our ears, all of us, every United Methodist, I need you to focus on people who nobody else is focused upon.
Right.
Really, I think we probably need to be aware, or at least understand, that if we're as a denomination or as a church and as local churches are going to be this voice and engine to bring about transformative change, that we're going to have to make the sacrifice of people who think we have totally gotten the gospel wrong.
Right.
You know, and there's going to be some hits.
Right.
And that we won't always be popular, but neither was our Savior.
Yeah.
or our founder, or our early fathers and mothers. And I don't know if any movement, significant movement, has taken place without the sacrifice, without the hits, without the misunderstandings. And, you know, that's get risky,
Right.
you know, and get threatening.
Right.
But I just think of all the people who have gone before us, who put their lives on the line for what they believed.
You know, there's one other thing. I do think, and I think there are times the church does not think this is their job. I think we have clergy think that, I think we have laity think that, and then I think we have a lot of laity and a lot of clergy who don't. But what I'm saying is that we're going to have to advocate for something bigger about a number of things. And I could give a list tonight. I don't want to do that. But I would say, first of all, just the mass incarceration of African American males. I mean, that has done nobody any good. We talk about the breakdown of the African American family. You know, that's something happened. Or we could talk about the access even to health care. COVID, if there's something COVID-19 has taught us that now more people know, is the inequity of the healthcare system. And that's basically, it is primarily racial, but it is significantly between the haves and the have-nots.
I think you gave us a prescription early on, at least one prescription.
What's that?
You said to me, maybe God has called us to the kingdom for such a time as now.
Such a time as this, absolutely. We're going to turn to some questions. Laura Eccles-Richter has been hosting this evening on our various platforms, and I think she's got some questions. Hi, Laura.
So questions for
Hi.
Bishop McKee.
Yeah, right.
We've got one for there, but first one is going to be for all of you. Is there a way to help guide people who are reluctant to acknowledge systemic racism?
You know, it's interesting. So I watched a little conversation about this afternoon. I left the office early today, which meant 4 o'clock instead of 5:30. But I caught a conversation when I got home, and basically is not everyone is ever going to acknowledge. We're not going to get anybody to acknowledge anything. Everybody to acknowledge one thing. So we work at the group that we need to work with, and this evidently this person had an opinion column in, she's the poet in residence at Vanderbilt, and she had a piece in the New York Times today or yesterday about focus on the people who say they aren't racist, but they're not doing anything. That's who we focus on, is like people who don't understand that. When you talk about people who literally are white supremacists, I don't think that's a conversation that is easily had yet. And so I think we focus on people who have those conversations and point that out. And I have to tell you, to come to this place where what systemic racism is and how it is and everything, that takes a lot of work for some people about what that really means. A piece of systemic racism is, I'll tell you, so when Ahmaud Arbery was shot in Brunswick, they let those guys go that day. And only as a month or so later that they were arrested, the 3 white men who were involved in that murder. If it had been a black man who had done that to a white man, I guarantee you, and everybody acknowledges this, or most people, there are people who won't, they would have gone to jail that very day. And that's systemic racism. But that doesn't happen.
Laura, I know one way we can help them, all of us, and I know the liturgy, and the bishop is here, so I can't remember the liturgy, but we say it every time we baptize someone.
You renounce the spiritual forces with wickedness and reject the evil powers of this world.
Yes. I think that's where we began.
I agree.
We say that every time you do a baptism, everyone in your congregation says it.
Right.
Or at least the family says it, and we all affirm it.
Well, and that's how we did Covenant Day,
Renew
and
our
Bishop Palmer spoke to each one of those baptismal vows. I think you're right.
I think that's one way.
Well, and it goes on to talk about how Christ has opened the church to people of all nations, races,
Nations,
and
yes. Okay, the liturgy is coming back to me.
yeah. So, a longtime Methodist is asking this question. What are your thoughts that our logo is a cross with a flame? Even though I know what it stands for, how does this affect people of color and our history in the United States?
that's getting traction now.
Well, our
It is
good,
getting
our friend and colleague Edlin Cowley had a wonderful post about that today, and I think is trying to do some work with our delegation related to the changing of our logo.
So, actually, a clergy friend of mine told me about this several years ago, because I hadn't thought about it. But he'd been talking to some African American clergy, and about what a challenge it was for them to see a burning cross. I do think it is a symbol that's well known, and so there's another story to that in terms of people who want to keep it are not the ones that we think would want to keep it, but it's really important in the Central Conference in Africa. I mean, that logo is really important, but I do think it's got some problems, and we're going to see what happens about it.
Yeah, I think it has some problems now. For me personally, I have not associated the cross and the flame with burning crosses, because I've always saw the flame as the presence of the Holy Spirit. I am very much aware how it can easily offend people of color, particularly African Americans. And I think it's going to get a lot of discussion, but I don't know where that's going.
Yeah. But Ron, we got to remember, we grew up in we're talking about the late '60s. We were aware of the of the creation of the United Methodist Church,
Yes,
the
yes.
getting rid of the central jurisdiction. We knew that was the spirit. We knew it was, I mean, we understand the logo. We don't talk about it that way anymore. And so I understand how it's happened.
Well, and I think one of the things that's happened in the last couple of months is, as we've started to listen to people's pain, we've also begun to see things that we've not thought about through the eyes of people that have been oppressed or people that have had significant pain in their life. I mean, I think that's part of what's going on with a lot of the statues that are coming down and a lot of the other symbols that are out there. And I know there's a lot of debate about that, but I think if nothing else, we have been reminded once again that the history that we were taught and that we have accommodated in our lives is not the total story. Laura did a beautiful devotional today, and one of the things she talked about was that the history she grew up with, she began to learn was not the whole history.
I think more important with the statues and the flag came down in Mississippi, was it today?
Yeah, the governor voted to change the flag.
Those persons who are now seeing things not from the prisons of their own eyes,
Right.
but the prisons of someone else's eyes.
Somebody else's, yeah.
And that's remarkable, because I think that's a beginning of understanding the pain of racism. Is not understanding it from, or seeing it from one's perspective, but from the perspective of those who have been pained and bruised by it. That's amazing, because it's sweeping through the country right now.
Right.
And that's one of the other painful things for me is I don't want to see the secular society take the lead over the church.
Right. Amen to that. Laura.
So the last question, as people have struggled with feeling like things are getting more political in the midst of these conversations, somebody asked, what is the Methodist stance on peaceful protest and conversations without violence victimizing our societies? And I would say the main part is, what is the Methodist stance on peaceful protest?
Well, the Methodists, we've always been for peaceful protest. I mean, we believe that's a right. We also know it's an American's right, and I think there's sometimes
Constitutional.
It's constitutional. I mean, yeah, it is constitutional, and so we're for protest. We act like protest because they stop things from certain things is an act of defiance. Well, protest is an act of defiance. We're not going to stand for this anymore. So I think we have to. We've all got to get clear that every time that not every time there's a protest, but there are times when there's a protest, that there's groups of people, we don't know who the groups are, I mean, I've read a number of things we all have, that take that opportunity to do that which is destructive. Now, we're not for that, but that doesn't mean we ought to stop peaceful protest. I think one of the things I noticed sometimes in some of the peaceful protests and some of the things I saw happening, frankly, there were many more white people doing some of the looting and some of the destruction stuff than there were African Americans. Some of the stuff. I can remember that somebody was painting something on a wall and saw it, and somebody tried to get them to stop it. And I mean, an African American tried to get these two Anglo women to stop it, and I mean, it got into a yell and screaming match. But what I'm saying is this is what racism does. We always think if there's looting or something happening, it's all the African Americans. So we're for protests. We're not for violence. We're not for destruction of property. So we should never assume that that's who it is. I think that's the way in which we see through our own lenses a lot of times. I watched something the other night, yesterday, and I was watching as the protesters, both black and white, were threatened by a couple of people. And Ron and I talked about this the other day, is that Martin Luther King had people who were marching on the outside of the protest, keeping people moving. And so there were people keeping people moving, not to taunt them. So there's nothing wrong with protesting. We do not affirm the destruction of property or anything. But Sharon told me this one time, said, Bishop, one thing you have to, and this is several years ago, people who've been oppressed and put down so long, it's finally going to light a fuse.
Yeah. Well, I would say I believe in passive resistance. I believe in passive resistance. Dr. King's strategy were rooted in the teachings of Jesus Christ. And when we protest, when we march, when we stand for justice, we never lose sight of who we are. We are the people of God. And Jesus taught us how to fight, and that's a hard way to fight. He said, if someone hits you on one cheek, turn the other cheek. That's what Dr. King taught. He taught his people, do not let your enemies bring you down to hating them. I think that's the way we have to fight.
Yeah.
I think that if we see this as a fight, then we have to see it as a righteous fight, and we have to fight as our Savior taught us to. So I believe in passive resistance, and we all condemn violence of any kind, and not just with other people, but the violence of emotional violence, of calling people names and putting people down.
I would just say, Laura, that it's not just our stance as United Methodist, it's our heritage.
Yes.
It's in our DNA.
Great word, great word.
Back to Wesley, social reform and social change was what the early Methodists were all about. We know that there were people marching during the civil rights movements who were Methodists. We think about the temperance movement was a lot of Methodists. We think about women's suffrage. All of those were resistance, and many of them involved peaceful protest, and many of them were really enacted, and participants were Methodists.
And this country was founded in protest.
Yeah, sure was.
Threw some good tea overboard.
Yeah.
Hey, I want to go back. Dr. Henderson mentioned something else, and I heard this author speak that he referred to the biographer of Frederick Douglass. This is an excellent book, and I do think something, and we've talked about briefly, something that's missing for many of us in our churches is an understanding of the history of our country.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And this Frederick Douglass book is an excellent piece about it.
Yeah.
I don't think I still think we're affected by the history of slavery to this day. I do not believe it's out of our psyche yet.
Yeah, and
our American psyche.
Yeah, I agree. And so it's like there was even a reframing or revision of that history of the early part of the 20th century,
Right.
which is why that's where most of the Confederate
That's where all the
statues.
statues came, yeah.
Yeah.
Back
Or the
in Jim Crow.
racism that grew out of that.
Right.
The big racism grew out of that piece in there.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is that racism, which of course slavery very much part of that, but the evil of racism is that it constantly redefines itself like a virus. And I mean, slaves became criminals. I've been watching the documentary 13th and how
I've not
he
seen
talked about
that
the
yet.
criminal justice system and how many people, the disproportionate numbers in our prisons is just, it's awful right now.
It's bad financial stewardship too.
Yes.
It's too expensive
It is.
for the crimes that were committed.
So we've come to the end of our time. I suspect by having three preachers up here, we could probably talk a little while longer, but we're going to hold close to our covenant to stay together. I wonder if we just might pause for a final word from our guests tonight. Bishop, you have a last word for us tonight?
So my final word is to the people at Grace Avenue and other United Methodists who may be watching, is that we're deeply committed to this work of a journey toward racial justice. We will put the plan forward and begin to unfold it, but we know that it's a multi-year effort, and it's going to be so ingrained in the work of the annual conference that will outlast my tenure as the bishop here.
Bishop McKee, thank you for being here tonight.
I'm glad to be here.
Quickly, I commend you, Laura,
Me
and
too.
all the members of this church for the great commitment you're making, and I affirm I'm your partner for racial equality.
Wonderful. Dr. Henderson, thank you for the 5 weeks now you've given to us to be here and to offer such a wonderful perspective in terms of where we are, but most important, where we're going. I hope that all of us realize that these next steps are actually first steps for us, and we are going to continue to be doing a lot of work in this area with the covenant relationship we have with the annual conference and with the district and with these two fine leaders. And so I am so thankful for their leadership and the work that we will be doing together in the future. I do want to make one other announcement and advertisement, if you will. This Sunday, as we come together to give thanks for God and our country, we're going to get to hear from Dr. Henderson. Ron Henderson will be bringing the message this week in our worship experiences that will be online at 11 a.m., and he will be talking about for a time such as this. Please plan to be with us this Sunday online on all the various platforms, and we look forward to continuing this conversation. Have a great evening. God bless you.